Welcome to Houston Sports Talk with your host, Robert Land.
Thanks for checking into the best Houston sports podcast, part of the Bleav Network. And joining me for Rockets conversation is USA Today's Rockets Wire's Ben DuBose, also host of the Loggerline podcast and Sports Talk 790 as well. Happy holidays, Ben. And I promise not to destroy the good cheer by reliving that Timberwolves game Friday night. I don't think so.
No, that was absolutely brutal. Happy holidays to you as well. And yeah, to blow a 16-point lead with under 5 to go at home as the number 2 seed in the West, it's tough. It still doesn't offset a 21-10 start, which I think any of us would have signed up for prior to the season. But it's a baffling loss that I think they're taking very seriously inside the building, because they just should not, especially defensively, get shredded the way they were late in that game.
Probably leads us to where the Rockets can improve, and that's offensively and superstar hunting and stuff like that. In a couple of minutes, I want to deep dive into this suddenly real possibility of the Kings' De'Aaron Fox being on the trade market. But before we go there, have you heard any whisper that the Rockets were into Jimmy Butler at all, or was there any scenario that Ben DuBose would have dealt for Jimmy Butler?
I don't think it's realistic. I think in a world where he would extend at a friendly figure, and if he was to leverage his way to Houston specifically, basically make it clear that he would not be willing to sign an extension, at least not on friendly terms, somewhere else, and you could get him for an extremely discounted rate and basically upgrade Dillon Brooks or Fred VanVleet in the rotation, I would consider it in that scenario. But at anything close to what I think would be his true market value, which is multiple first-round picks, giving him a deal at or somewhat close to the max for at least, 2-3 years going into the, late 2020s, I'm not willing to do that for a 35-year-old Jimmy Butler. I think as a theoretical exercise, he's an interesting name. As a practical one, not so much. I just don't think he's so much better than the options you have right now with your veterans, to where it would be worth dipping into your war chest of future first-round picks, talented young players, especially when you have guys like De'Aaron Fox, like Devin Booker, that could be available but are in much more age alignment with what you're trying to do.
Not to mention weird personality, lots of miles on the tires. It's not like he's playing 82 games on a regular basis. Anyway, he's a guy that you just can't count on. I just like the idea of, in this NBA that we're in right now, you get guys that can play closer to 82. And I think there's some real value there too.
And the other issue with Jimmy is that he's not really a shooter. I think, he's certainly known for his leadership, his defense. Well, this team is already good in those areas. And it's not that you can't make a strength stronger, but I think if you're going to invest heavily, you would rather improve one of your weaknesses, which it starts with being able, it's the backcourt, and it's being able to shoot from distance and space the floor so the guys like Alper and Şengün have more room to operate. It's not that Jimmy's a bad player by any means, but I just don't see that he upgrades your weaknesses enough to where, especially at his age and with those injury concerns you laid out, that it's worth paying what it would cost. And when I've asked people inside the building, that's generally what I've heard as well. In a very idealistic sense, would they be interested in him? If the price was low enough, sure, but it's just very unlikely for that to be the case. Given the competition, there's other teams like the Warriors, like the Mavs, like maybe the Suns that have a much greater sense of urgency than the current Rockets that are willing to bid heavily. And also in terms of his next contract, because you're not trading for Jimmy Butler as a 2-month rental. That's silly. No, any team that theoretically trades for him would be trading for the right to keep him for the next 2 or 3 years. And what are the odds that he's going to be willing to give back a lot of money to sort of compensate for those age and injury risks? No, he's going to want to get paid like a star, like he is when he's at his best, even though for the most part, he's not at his best for the reasons you laid out. So I think it would be silly to completely rule it out, because he's a good enough player that theoretically, if he was available for cheap, sure, it's not like it would hurt your team. It would make you better. But in terms of looking at the actual asset cost and how a deal would actually come together, no, I can't see it.
So let's go to De'Aaron Fox, and he's an all-star shot creator, efficient, clutch, and in his absolute prime, 27 years old. He's also somebody that grew up in Houston, really well-liked teammate and person. Can you think of any reason why the Rockets should not pursue De'Aaron Fox?
For me, it comes down to the asset cost. I think if you have to dip heavily into the Phoenix stockpile of picks and the Suns are struggling and you think you have a path to Devin Booker as soon as next offseason, one thing I was told when we went through this exercise last offseason in terms of potential star chasing and the options available, the two names at the forefront of the Rockets list, really around the entire NBA, were Devin Booker and Donovan Mitchell. Now, Mitchell, for the time being, I think is off the market given how strong Cleveland has started the season. But with the Suns at 500, I don't think Booker is ungettable at all. I mean, well, he's ungettable right now, but in terms of the next 12 to 18 months, yeah, there are absolutely scenarios where the Suns basically have their hand forced. And because you have their future picks, you're in a uniquely valuable spot to them as a trade partner. So I would be hesitant to cash in all of those picks for De'Aaron Fox if I think there's a path to someone that's a better fit later on. Because there are, when we talk about adding De'Aaron Fox to this team, obviously he's going to start in the backcourt. If you started with Fred VanVleet, it's a very small backcourt. You have to ask if you can hold up defensively with those two guys. If you start him with Jalen Green, that's two guys that shoot below 34% from three. So you question if the spacing is going to be there, and quite frankly, would you have enough asset-wise to get De'Aaron Fox if you're keeping Jalen Green? Would Fred and Reed Shepherd and maybe one or two first-round assets that aren't part of the Phoenix stockpile be enough? Because one thing I don't subscribe to, I don't really buy the theory I've seen thrown out that, oh, you can trade for De'Aaron Fox, and if Booker or someone like that comes available later, then okay, just use Fox as bait for Devin Booker. No, I don't think that's the way a team like Phoenix pivoting from Devin Booker, if he's got the proverbial gun pointed at their head, would want to go. I think they would want to do what the Nets did a few months ago, which is have the right to bottom out, rebuild through the draft more sustainably. And so that's why I think the Rockets holding Phoenix's future draft capital is more valuable to them than even De'Aaron Fox, because De'Aaron Fox, while a good player, he's not an A1. He's not the type of player that just because you add him to an NBA team, they're going to make the playoffs, they're going to win 50 games and be in the conversation. He's a very good player. He's not to that tier. So for me, while he's definitely an upgrade over Fred VanVleet, he's also an upgrade over Jalen Green. He would make this team better. And for a team that's been second or third in the West all year, I'm certainly interested in him. I would not unload the cupboard of assets to make it happen at all costs. For me, a De'Aaron Fox deal would need to happen under the right circumstances. And the way I look at it, Robert, I'm personally hoping, and I actually think this is what's going to play out, that the Kings stall this out until next offseason. Because them firing Mike Brown and De'Aaron being under contract until 2026, that tells me that it's not a team that's looking in the very short term to blow things up. And even if De'Aaron asks out by the February trade deadline, I think the Kings could go to him and say, look, no one's going to trade for you, even with, 1+ seasons left, under the idea that you're a rental. A team trading for you is going to do so because they think they're going to get your signature on an extension. So even if we wait until the offseason, the market's still going to be there, but there's going to be more options to the Kings because more teams around the NBA are willing and able to do bigger deals in the offseason. And so if you wait until the offseason, then I think that gives the Rockets much more clarity about certainly the development of their own young players. We see how, the current team looks in the playoffs. Do certain guys take a leap or do they not? You also get more clarity about other situations around the league, like Devin Booker. And if the Suns salvage this, and it looks like, a few months ago, we thought Donovan Mitchell might be available. Now he's not, because Cleveland figured it out. Maybe Phoenix figures it out as well. And in that case, then there's potentially more of an incentive to say, you know what, De'Aaron Fox is better than what we have. So even if it costs a lot, let's just get this done and worry about the rest later. I think from a Rocket standpoint, the best case scenario is to try and stall this until next summer, get more data from this season.
Can I jump in? Because
Sure.
you let open like three or four can of worms that I was not expecting
fair.
to say. Number one, I personally, I don't think there's this huge difference between De'Aaron Fox and Devin Booker as far as, how good they are as a player. Both guys, all-star level players. They're not top 10 heliocentric. This isn't Giannis, Luka, Doncic. Yeah, you can disagree, but that's my take on these two guys. Number two, I guess it's one of my pet peeves with Rockets fans is, okay, let's wait and wait and wait and wait for the perfect guy, the absolute, like, oh my God, we got to get this guy. Look, sometimes these windows don't last forever. The Rockets should be looking for a guy that's kind of an in your prime type player right now, because you've got some of these young guys right now why they're relatively cheap. And so, and it's just and I don't like this whole idea of like, we're not interested unless it's a top 5 or 10 player. I know that's not what you think, Ben, but it's one of my issues. I mean, the Rockets, the idea is like, okay, we got to save all our assets if, say, Luka, Jokic, or Giannis becomes available. Number one, they might never become available. In the meantime, again, your assets once seemed valuable, quickly lose valuable. Draft picks all of a sudden lose value as with every single year. Number two, the goal should always be, when you're at this point in the process, to find ways to get better. Even if it's 5 or 10% or 20%, that should be the goal. Once you're where the Rockets are, you don't want to go backwards. You're trying to get better. And how does having an elite point guard not make you more of a destination for another star, somebody else that wants to come to Houston? Or you may not have some first round picks if fill in the blank superstar becomes available. But again, I agree with this idea, and I guess you don't, that having a guy like Fox as a trade asset, Ben, is better trade ammunition than a bunch of random first round picks. I mean, I guess I disagree with you on that, because then that other team, even if they're not interested in De'Aaron Fox, can it could three-way that you could give them so much more. And De'Aaron Fox is a guy that I don't think he's going to lose value, while these picks down the line could lose value. While, as the more people see of some of the Rockets core that they want to include in that trade, could lose value.
It's unlikely to happen between February and next summer. With Jalen Green, at this point, I honestly think there's more of a case for his value to go up than down. If the status quo holds, he would basically be viewed as a reclamation project. Put him in a different system.
Well, his value right now is you have to throw in extra draft picks, I think, just to get somebody to take Jalen Green.
I don't agree with that. But I would say, regardless, there's not a lot of downside with Jalen to waiting. And then if you go younger, guys like Cam Whitmore, Reed Shepherd, they're so young with their developmental curves. Cam, even in year 2, one of the youngest guys in his draft class, that I don't think anyone's going to look at them dramatically different, at least not in a worse way, by waiting until next summer. The one pushback I would give to you, Robert, I would agree with you in an abstract sense about a random NBA team preferring De'Aaron Fox to a package of first-round picks. The reason I think it's different is there is one very specific team, the Phoenix Suns, that the Rockets have very carefully put this plan in motion to bet against. And one specific player in Devin Booker that they do think is a tier ahead of De'Aaron Fox. And I think also defensively, for what Ime Udoka wants to do, I think a relatively small, undersized, light guy like De'Aaron Fox, I do have questions as to whether you can truly build a top 5 level defense with him as, a 35 minutes per game centerpiece. And so if you can use these assets for a guy that you have internally targeted for months, maybe years in Devin Booker, I do think that's where the calculus shifts, because it's not just abstractly saying, De'Aaron Fox should be more valuable. No, we can look at their individual situation and say, to the Phoenix Suns, their picks are going to be more valuable to them in a scenario where Devin Booker wants to leave. Now, with that said, to your point, I would not drag this out forever. I would agree with you that if by next offseason the Suns aren't closer to breaking it up, you can't just stall this out until 2026, 2027, just wait for the perfect move and say, even if someone that's an upgrade like De'Aaron Fox clearly would be, is available now, we're just going to keep punting it back, keep rolling it over for the sake of assets. I agree with your point from that perspective, but I just don't think waiting from February until June is going to be all that costly. And I do think there's a lot of upside potentially. So that's the one pushback I would have. I agree with you in sort of a philosophical sense, but in terms of this very specific situation in the timeline, I would feel more comfortable waiting until after the season, because I think the guys that the Rockets would be willing to trade, look at Jalen Green, Cam Whitmore, Reed Shepherd, I don't see a ton of downside risk to their value by waiting. I could be wrong. That's just my read of the market. But I think a lot of the downside for those three guys in particular is already weighted in right now.
Just real quickly, I mean, I want to move on pretty quickly from this, but just I'm starting to see warts with some Reed Shepherd stuff, and I think the longer any guy is out there, you're going to start seeing some warts. And as far as building a top 5 defense around De'Aaron Fox, I frankly don't think that's any different than building a top 5 defense with Jalen Green as a part of it. And Jalen and De'Aaron Fox are, interchangeable, and De'Aaron Fox with Udoka as his coach, I think can still be better defensively. And it's not like he's not somebody with some athletic ability the same way Jalen Green is. But I want to quickly move on from that, because I do want to ask you what you'd be willing to give up for Fox in a deal like this. But first, if you fans of Houston Sports Talk enjoy our content, tell your friends, share our links on your social media. And if you've got takes on the Rockets, let me know in the YouTube comments. In the next couple of days, look for a new show with an NBA insider to 2 more potential Rockets trade targets. And if you missed it, watch our live Texans postgame Thursday. Tom Chavaria and I hit on D'Amico and Stroud Panic, among other things. And also subscribe on YouTube so you get updates on all the new content. Give us a thumbs up and listen on the go with your favorite podcast app. All right, Ben, what Rockets assets would you be willing to give up in a De'Aaron Fox trade?
My preference would be to build it around Fred rather than Jalen. And I saw the hypothetical thrown out, I believe it was Bleacher Report a few days ago, with Fred, Reed Shepherd, and 1 or 2 first-round picks. If I could do that while keeping most or all of the Phoenix assets, in other words, preserving your optionality for a Booker move down the line, then I would be okay with that. There's certainly more upside to Jalen than with Fred. For me, Fred brings a lot of value, but obviously De'Aaron brings even more of that as a veteran at the same position who's just a better basketball player. And I haven't heard any character concerns with De'Aaron. So as much as Fred is liked in the locker room, I don't have any reason to believe that De'Aaron wouldn't be. So if you could, in terms of, the veteran spot, and I understand De'Aaron's 27, Fred's 30, but we're talking veteran compared to the young core. And you could, from an asset standpoint, use just Reed Shepherd or maybe Cam Whitmore if you're keeping Jalen. Let's say 1 of Reed or Cam, and first-round picks that are not from the Phoenix Suns, or 1 at most. I would be okay with that. I would be more comfortable waiting until the off season. But for me, that would be a low enough cost that if it was available in February, and if you passed on it, then somebody else is probably going to get De'Aaron Fox, then I'd say, you know what, let's go ahead and do it. For me, that's where I would draw the line. I want to preserve the optionality of doing something with the Phoenix Suns later. So if you could lose just 1 of Fred or Jalen, ideally Fred, and stay away from that Phoenix stockpile of picks, I would be okay with that. To me, that would make sense.
Who of the Rockets' young core is off limits for you, for Fox, or maybe for a lot of different players? Who's off limits?
Certainly Amen Thompson, and most likely Alperen Şengün. I mean, if we're talking Giannis, I wouldn't totally rule it out, but I would say in most scenarios, I would put Alperen Şengün off limits along with Amen Thompson. I have a hard time seeing them let go of Jabari, because I think Jabari is probably going to be more valuable to the Rockets than he would be in a trade, simply because of how plug and play he is and how insanely high his floor is. I don't think he would move the needle enough in a trade to be worth losing him to your longer term formula. I don't think he would bring you enough. Amen and Şengün are at the top of the list. Jabari right after that. I'm a little worried about Tari's leg. I'll be honest with you. To have the same issue 2 years in a row and for this to go on as we're recording. It's been 5 games and counting with no return date in sight. I love Tari when he plays, but this worries me a little bit, especially because about a month prior to him going out after the NBA Cup, he hadn't really been the same guy since about the middle or latter stages of November. When you look at his percentages, he had begun to dip about a month before he went out with this lower leg management. So
do you know if this is related to last year, or is
it
this
is.
something?
Yeah,
It is. Yeah.
it's soreness in the same exact. Yep. And hopefully, I would love to get the Twitter doctor, so to speak, to weigh in about just how normal this is after surgery. But yeah, it's the same, lower left leg, the same issue he had last year. I'm hoping that it's just a standard post-surgery thing. We're about 9 months out now, but obviously I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not going to pretend that I know everything on that front. But yeah, I would put Jabari and Tari in the same tier, maybe Tari a little bit higher if I believed in health for both of those guys. But with Jabari being 2 years younger and Tari having an injury risk, I put Jabari a little bit ahead right now. I, hope I look back on that in a few months and say that's a silly take because I was overreacting to a 2-week stretch in December where Tari didn't play due to injury. But right now, I would not make Tari as untouchable as a lot of people in the Rockets fan community seem to have done. So I would say Amin should go at the forefront of the list. Jabari, Tari, and then Jalen, Cam, and Reed. To me, those are clearly at the back of the line. And, as far as which I would prefer, a lot of it, to me, Jalen, Cam, and Reed are all fairly close in value and that there's upside, but they all have clear warts. And so to me, it just sort of comes down to who are you trading them for? Is it for someone more established? In that case, losing the proven production of a fourth-year guy like Jalen Green probably isn't as impactful. If you're bringing in a wing player, then you all of a sudden have so much depth there that maybe it's easier to lose Cam. But for me, Jalen, Cam, and Reed are sort of at the back of the line. And in terms of which it makes sense to move, it just depends on who you're bringing in and what the roster fit looks like at the end of it.
Yeah, and as far as Cam, I love Cam. In fact, I love him more than I love Reed Shepherd at this moment because I just feel like the size and the athleticism is just at a whole other level, and the weaknesses in Reed Shepherd's game defensively obviously concern me a ton. Offensively, Cam's ability just to come off, as even a rookie, Reed Shepherd, we say, oh, he was just a rookie, so we're not expecting this explosion amount of points, but we saw Cam do that at a younger age. So yeah, I would be willing to give up Cam and Reed Shepherd. Cam also has the injury concerns supposedly coming out of college that kind of scared some other teams off. So you have to sort of factor all that in. But I will say that, and I guess this is where we separate, Ben. I just get fearful of waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for this perfect trade. I'm willing to give up, Reed and Cam easily. I mean, I'm definitely willing to give up Jalen because I'm done. I just don't buy into it anymore. I mean, there's just too many flaws in Jalen's game. And I don't like the contract that he's on right now because if he is a bust, you're kind of in a mess right now because he's got that 3rd-year option and it's a lot of money. He's not worth what the Jalen that we're seeing right now is not worth what he's going to get paid over the next 3 years at $30+ million a year. In my mind, give up some of those guys to not have to give up some of the draft choices. And I think it's going to take some draft choices to get. I don't think you give up, obviously I'm not give up all draft choices or whatever. I would rather keep some of the draft choices and give up, a couple of these guys from the young core just because I'm not sold on them. I mean, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I feel like the first round picks you could hold on to if you can in a trade like that, to where, you don't have to give up other guys and it gives you some options down the road too, to add to what you're doing.
Yeah, I'm not as down on Jalen as you are. I mean, I have concerns, but especially the past month, I did a story the other day. His true shooting percentage ever since Thanksgiving, the stretch between Thanksgiving and Christmas, was over 60 while putting in basically 21, 22 points a game. Defense has taken steps forward. I get the warts. I see the concerns in terms of can he do it against good teams, especially good teams that have rim protection like the Timberwolves with Rudy Gobert. I get that, but there's been enough improvement. There's enough talent still there that I don't view him as a negative asset by any means. It's not that he's untouchable. No, I'm not, going back to March of this year and saying, oh, I Bleav he's a cornerstone, but I wouldn't move him for the sake of moving him or treat him as a negative asset just yet. I think certainly if you're moving him for De'Aaron Fox, I mean, there's enough value there to where from a basketball standpoint, it's hard to argue against it. But if you could keep Jalen and move Fred instead, a guy who we know as he goes into his 30s, it's not that he's necessarily going to leave the team, but his role is certainly going to decline. I would feel more comfortable moving Fred instead of Jalen, especially if you're not, if Jalen, let me clarify. If Jalen isn't being valued by the Kings as a significantly positive asset. In other words, if you're including Jalen in the trade primarily for his contract and to have the ability to match salaries for De'Aaron Fox, then in that scenario, I would rather just move the older Fred VanVleet, who there's some contractual uncertainty with moving forward anyway, as well as just how important his role is going to be moving forward. Now, if Jalen is viewed as a significantly positive asset and you're not just looking at him as salary filler, but he's a big part of the trade in terms of someone the Kings actually want for basketball reasons, then, that's a different discussion. But in that scenario, then you shouldn't have to give up as many other prospects or first round picks because they're valuing Jalen highly. But I think, if the value on Jalen, I would say around the league, I think on his current deal, it's probably neutral. It sounds like you view it as probably negative, but I would say in either scenario, negative or neutral, then I would say just move Fred instead, use him as the salary component, because I just don't see enough of a difference between Fred and Jalen, especially if you're bringing in De'Aaron Fox, who would be able to, provide a lot of the benefits that Fred does now, to be worth, punting on whatever upside is left in Jalen Green.
And I'll just, I think people know me by now. We're on not the same page at all with Jalen, but I do want to ask you this. Can you explain as simply as possible for us cap dummies why it's so hard to include Jalen Green in deals before the offseason?
Yeah, and that's another factor. It's not impossible. It's actually easier to deal Jalen than Şengün because as the number 2 overall pick from 2021, his initial salary is higher than Şengün's. So basically, he would count as outgoing salary for the Rockets at $12 million, which is pretty much his rate this season. But for the team trading for him at, I Bleav, $30 million or 29. Basically, what it comes down to is that even though right now he is being paid $12 million or 12.5 as the final year of his rookie scale contract, because he has already been given a contract extension for future years, obviously a team trading for him would be doing so with the plan of having him in those future seasons. So because of that, the spirit of the collective bargaining agreement would suggest that Jalen should be treated as something closer to the future contract, not the artificially low contract that he's on right now. And so it's not so much that the CBA wants to punish Houston, but it's just in terms of how you put a deal together. Look, he is only making $12.5 million this year. That's factually true. And so from a Houston standpoint, it's hard to work around that. But in terms of a team trading for him, you shouldn't be able to trade for him at a lower figure when it's already signed and on the books that he's going to be on whatever salary books he's on, next off season at a much higher figure. And so there's about a $17 million delta. That's the bottom line between the outgoing salary of Jalen for the Rockets in a trade and the incoming salary of Jalen for whatever team is acquiring him, because whatever team is acquiring him would be doing so under the spirit of having him for future years. And it's not impossible to overcome that, because basically all you need to do, if you're the Rockets, then you need to sort of offset that $17 million delta by unloading $17 million in other players. Well, they have a number of guys veterans on expiring contracts, Jeff Green, Jock Landale, Jayshawn Tate, that aren't really that important to this team, you could send them into, trade exceptions, cap room, whatever the case may be. You could rope in a third team and, incentivize them with, I don't know, future second round draft picks, money. It's not that hard, especially because in the NBA, Robert, like, salaries are prorated when you're doing these deals during the year. So if Jock Landale, we look at him as an $8 million salary, well, by February, about 2/3 of that will have already been paid off. So really, we're only talking about like $2.5 million, and teams can trade up to like $6 or $7 million in cash every year. So you could basically pay the other team to take on the salary, basically the exact same amount that they would be giving to Jock Landale or Jeff Green or whoever it may be. So it is a complicating factor, but it's not as difficult as the conventional narrative would have you to believe. It's a much bigger deal for Alperen Şengün, because with Şengün, his current salary is much lower because he was, the number 16 overall pick. So because of that, it'd be very difficult to trade Şengün this year. But for Jalen, the difference between 12 and 29, about 17 million, it's a nuisance, but the Rockets have enough in expiring salaries that I don't think it makes a deal, off the table by any means.
If I'm hearing you right, Ben, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's almost like they don't want to credit the Rockets for, having Jalen at a low rate and give them that option and ability to, hey, we got a guy in the draft that, he's making this amount and maybe he's got a bigger value and we signed him to an extension. It's almost like you're not crediting the team for doing a good job with a particular player, or it feels like more and more of the CBA is punishing teams for sometimes doing the right thing.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
Well, I think some of it is also the Players Association wanting to protect their guys from being viewed as assets. And so in this case, because it does make a deal more complicated, it minimizes the scenarios of guys being signed specifically for the purpose of being turned around and almost immediately traded. And so I think that's a big component of this as well, in that, certainly there are motivating factors to not let, a team acquiring a guy coming off a rookie scale contract to be acquired at an artificially low rate for what he's going to be on their salary books moving forward. But I also think that part of this comes down to it comes down to wanting players wanting to feel that when they sign a deal with a team like Jalen did with the Rockets just a couple of months ago, that they at least have a season of stability. And in an NBA where there's more and more player movement, I think that's another reason why you haven't seen too much pushback on this. I think the Players Association sort of likes the idea of making it harder, the poison pill, as some people call it, making it harder to try to trade these guys who recently signed extensions.
If a star player is not available at the deadline, is there a non-star player or two you believe the Rockets should target? Preferably a playmaking guard would be my preference. And are you willing to give up one of their war chest of future first-round picks for a non-star?
If it's not a Phoenix pick, that's the distinction I will again throw in. I think those Phoenix picks are really important to them. There's a reason they did that deal with the Nets last June. But I look at a guy like Malcolm Brogdon. I think he's had an underwhelming year in Washington, but for most of his career, he's been above 40% from three. We know that's been a weakness for this team, but someone that can take on the lead guard responsibilities. I think what stood out to me about this team, and you touched on this earlier, Reed Shepherd is nowhere close to ready. Now, I'm not going to say that I'm worried about him being a bust by any means. I think we shouldn't forget that he's had just one season of college basketball as a reserve. This is a huge jump, especially for a guy who's undersized at the NBA level. So the learning curve is a lot steeper than we thought. But because Reed isn't really trustworthy, and I don't see these issues resolving themselves by the end of this season, basically the Rockets have just two lead guards that Ime Udoka trusts, and Fred VanVleet and Jalen Green. And thankfully, to this point in the season, both of those guys have been healthy. But at some point, there's probably going to be an injury to one of those two guys. And even if there's not, Jalen has enough warts himself in terms of how inconsistent he is. And I suppose you can say Fred has been this year as well, with, the shooting numbers falling off a cliff relative to last year. I mean, we're 30 games in, so we can't act like it's nothing anymore. That to me is a spot that you can clearly upgrade. I mean, shooting abstractly is something that this team needs more of, but they have enough depth at the wing positions, especially with Cam Whitmore coming on late as well, that I'm not as worried about what they can do at the 2, 3, 4 spots, especially with Dylan Brooks and Tari Eason coming back from injury in the near future. In Tari's case, we hope he is. But it's at the guard spot. I don't think Reed Shepherd is going to be ready. Aaron Holiday is nice, but I don't think you're counting on Aaron Holiday being a rotation player in the playoffs. And so right now you basically have Fred VanVleet and Jalen Green, and you're sort of staggering, alternating those guys to where you have one of them on the court for all 48 minutes. And what if one of them gets hurt? Or what if they're just not good enough, which has been the case for a lot of this year. So if you could get a guy that doesn't, that doesn't compromise your long-term salary books, like Brogdon's on a $22 million expiring contract, you could easily just, put together Jock Landale and Jeff Green's contracts, and that deal is going to work. And you have Steven Adams and Jayshawn Tate there as well. If you can basically compile some of those expiring salaries into one larger salary that fills a need that is obviously greater than what the expiring guys are giving you right now, that's the kind of deal that I would look at. And so Malcolm Brogdon, it could be the sort of the perfect buy low opportunity, and that based on his age and based on the fact that last I looked, he's only shooting like 33% from three this year, and he's in a bad situation in Washington. So there's not a lot of incentive for him to play better. He's also not getting a lot of good looks because the team is dreadful. Maybe you can get him with, second round picks or heavily protected first. That's the kind of guy that I would be looking at. It's addressing both shooting and the lead guard position to supplement or give you other options beyond Fred VanVleet and Jalen Green, because to me, that's the clear deficiency for this team.
We just got the news that Jonathan Feigen is retiring from the Chronicle after nearly 3 decades. What came to mind, Ben, for you when you heard that news? Because you've known Jonathan for years now.
He's a great guy. He's a great reporter. But what I said on my Twitter or X timeline, what stands out to me most about Jonathan, and this is what I'll always appreciate about him, he set a tone for others in the media, or in the media core, I should say, that in my experience covering sports in Houston and some beyond Houston is fairly rare. I think, especially in the world since 2010 or so, where there's more startups, there's more quote unquote fanboy competition, there's fewer full-time jobs, it can be very easy for the old guard to become jaded, to become elitist and closed off. And I'm not going to name names, but I've seen it on other beats to where outsiders, they're basically not a part of the club or the clique. It was never like that with Jonathan. Now, to be clear, Jonathan, he's a very competitive guy. He wanted his scoops. He wanted things that he could attach to his name, as any good journalist would. It's his beat. But it doesn't need to be confrontational. It doesn't need to be uncomfortable. Because at the end of the day, it should be about the reader. It should be about the consumer. It should be about, making, in this case, the Rockets fan base more informed about what's going on behind the scenes with their favorite basketball team. And if you can not just preserve your own spot in an increasingly shrinking media industry, but also lift up those around you to where the overall quality of the work to the end reader is better. To me, that's what makes a really special journalist. And that's what I sort of took out of my years with Jonathan Feigen. He was always kind to me. He was always helpful. I saw him doing the same things with other young journalists that were new to the beat in recent years. He never looked at it as a competitive thing the way I saw a lot of other veteran journalists around other beats in this town and others do. He was very friendly. He knew when to be competitive. There was a fiery side to him, but he set a tone within the Rockets media core, I guess that's what I'll call them, that wasn't nearly as adversarial as a lot of others that I've been a part of in my time in Houston and elsewhere. And that's something that I think is ultimately to the betterment of the readers, the listeners, the viewers, because the more quality journalists, the more quality media people you have around and following a team, the more informed the fan base is going to be, the more we're going to learn about what's going on, the more we're going to be able to accurately tell the story of what's going on behind the scenes and what the thought processes and considerations are when we're talking about, should they trade for De'Aaron Fox or wait for Devin Booker and debates like that. To me, Jonathan, he had a very fine line to walk between obviously wanting to preserve his role, get the stories that he needed to get to justify being the primary beat writer for the only newspaper in town. But yet he did it in a way that wasn't adversarial or harsh to his competitors on the beat. He was always approachable. He was always helpful. And so he found a way both to provide value to his own role and also lift up others around him. And so that's one of the highest compliments I can give, because in this media landscape where there aren't many jobs anymore, it seems to be contracting by the year, and it can be very easy to get jaded. It can be very easy to get cynical, to go into a mindset of self-preservation to where I've got to do what I got to do to survive, and anybody else is just potentially in the way, screw them. It was never like that with Jonathan. He was a good journalist, but he was also a good man. He cared about the end product. He cared about the reader more than himself. And so I'm going to miss him. I have high hopes for Danielle Lerner, who's going to be taking over that beat. But Jonathan Feigen did a lot, not just in terms of the stories he put into the Chronicle, but the overall culture that he built for media covering the Rockets. Because ultimately, it's the mainstays that set that culture. There are people like me and others that come on, contract employees that are there sometimes, but there's a very select few, the team broadcasters, and the team broadcasters, they're sort of in their own tier because obviously they're getting paychecks directly from the organization. Jonathan is not. So there are very few full-time independent guys that are not just at the home games, but going on road trips, that are with them on a day in, day out basis. And so because of that, they can sort of set the tone in terms of how the whole media apparatus works together or doesn't work together. Jonathan set the best tone that I've seen in my years of following beats in sports media. And so I'm going to miss him a lot, and that's what I think of the most when I think of Jonathan Feigen.
It's tough to see another one of the old guard go. I mean, all the old guard has been very great to me as a journalist whenever I've covered any of the teams in Houston. Just one last quick word on De'Aaron Fox before we wrap things up. I got a chance to cover him in high school. I shot his games. I did a feature story. I'm going to link that up at the end of the YouTube video. You'll see it on the screen so you can click on it. It's got about 40,000 views. I did it for a statewide high school show, and you can see that this is a great kid. I mean, he was doing charity work. He was doing community work in high school in Houston. He's somebody that I would love to see the Rockets get. I also think I don't want to get into like a major bidding war, but it might be between the Rockets and the Spurs, and that's going to matter if the Rockets can get him, keep him away from Wembanyama, and gosh, I think I screwed that name. Why did I just say Wemby? Wemby. Keep away from Wemby. But would love to get him in a Rockets uniform. Just a reminder, he's at Ben DuBose on X. Find the content on USA Today's The Rockets Wire and The Logger Line. Anything you want to plug, Ben, before we take off?
No, just rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage. And just quickly to your point on De'Aaron Fox, everything that I've heard behind the scenes is that he's a low maintenance guy. He's a joy to be around. Obviously, he has ties to Houston. So that's why, I am open to moving Fred in that type of deal. As much as Fred is important in the clubhouse, it's not like you're potentially moving him in a scenario like this for someone who's very high maintenance and not a culture guy. Now, everything I've heard behind the scenes is that De'Aaron Fox, excuse me, very good guy, very low maintenance. And so that's why I would have confidence bringing him in.
Mr. Subliminal Man loves the Devin Booker throw in that you got in there.
All right.
You're trying so hard to get him to Houston. I know you are. No doubt about it. And I don't see any Rockets fans upset that Fred VanVleet's going out the door right now. The way things are going with him, and obviously trading Fred for an all-star level point guard. I mean, it's Fred's position, so it's like, why? Fred would not play nearly as much anyway. You might get him 15 minutes if De'Aaron was around. So yeah, trading him for Fred in that scenario, along with some of the assets, would be no problem. But hey, Ben, thanks a lot for doing this, and love catching up with you. And hopefully something big will happen in the next few months with the Rockets. That'd be great.
Hope so. Thanks for having me, Robert.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.
Hey, don't forget to support us by subscribing and commenting on YouTube. You can always listen to us on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. Tell your friends about us and share our show links on social media. Spread the word, everybody. Thanks for listening.